Oh no, I got triggered on Twitter again. I saw a tweet that I hated enough to sit here and complain because I feel like most of the conversation about backend versus frontend sucks. It just doesn't capture the nuances or the reality of shipping software. As soon as we get into the semantics of REST or why GraphQL servers are perfect, I feel like we lose the reality of what application developers experience every day. While I very much believe in the full stack future, it's important to recognize that most developers lean heavily into backend or frontend, which means the developers on both sides regularly block the developers on the other side. Another important reality to recognize is that most APIs have between 0 and 1 client. There are many APIs that's not the case for, people who are building things that are used by millions, if not billions of applications and users and people, but most backends serve 1 client. And this is a point that regularly frustrates me. It feels like people love to architect their backends for imaginary users, not for the people who will actually be building on them. It feels like front ends expect their backends to be perfectly shaped around their exact current use case. Why am I bringing this up? Well, you should look at the tweet. This is the thing that triggered me. Corey was contracting, helping audit a code base, and one of their REST APIs returned a JSON blob that had 3 fields in it, table 1, table 2, and main, and then complained that you shouldn't couple your API to UI elements. I think this is stupid. I think complaining about this is really silly because these APIs are almost certainly being used exclusively by that front end, and building them around what the user needs makes a lot of sense. And you'll see in most of the replies here, both me being blocked, but more importantly, Ryan Florence and I hard agreeing. I had this argument with a backend dev on our team. I made an endpoint specifically for the UI I was building and only needed 2 complicated but efficient DB queries to get it. He insisted I use the existing REST endpoints and blocked my PR. So I did it his way and made 13 requests with several sequential chains. The DB load, network load, and UX were all far worse. I profiled it and showed the numbers and included our ops/inver team on the next PR. They blocked the new PR and merged the original one with a bespoke endpoint. Most applications and most user interfaces don't need all of the data your API provides if you have a generic API. This is a huge part of why something like GraphQL exists, enabling you to specify on the client side what data you do and, more importantly, don't need. But what if it was easy enough on the backend side to write the exact thing you need for your front end when you need it? This is one of the things I push for really hard, and Ryan agrees almost fully here. It's one of the major reasons he hates the backend front end split on teams. Their argument was that he was making tech debt when he made the right API for the job, and that he would be making something less tech debty if he was to make the experience worse for the users. By using all of these generic API endpoints that already exist, he would be forced to make the front end way more complex. And this is the thing I see a lot at companies of all sizes, where the front end teams get told by backend, hey, here's how the API works. You have to use it this way. And now the front end is kind of expected to deal with it and then build all sorts of crazy things around it. And when they say, hey, it'd be nice if the API did this thing, backend says 1 of 2 things. Cool, we'll get to it in 3 months. Or, oh, sorry, we don't care. And now on the front end, you're doing all sorts of crazy stuff. Even when the front end and backend teams are somewhat close and well aligned, you'll end up with crazy issues. And if you want examples of that, browse Twitch. God, I have a lot of salt about these things because these problems are very real and they don't get the credit that they deserve. One of the coolest things that happened to me as a developer when I moved from backend to frontend at Twitch was I got to understand this dynamic and the complexity of this relationship, and more importantly, the needs of frontend. And then with tools like Next.js and Remix and all these other wonderful things that make it easier to write the right backend for your front end, became clear to me that this doesn't have to be so goddamn complex. A lot of the complexity in making perfectly standardized APIs and then eating the cost of it on your front end is unnecessary if you have tools that make it way easier to build those relationships in the first place. Things like TRPC, where you can literally right-click, go to definition on the front end to your backend and have the exact code you're getting that data from, all inferred back to front. Why shouldn't I be able to query the data I need in the component that needs it? This is the magic of these new patterns like React server components. We're no longer thinking in terms of the backend team, the front end team, and the end all be all API. We're thinking in terms of what data is needed to show the user what they need to see. And the components themselves can determine what data they need on the backend itself, instead of having to make this weird abstracted translation layer between the backend and the database, the GraphQL, whatever you put in the middle, and then the client side that somehow hopes all of this comes through on the other end. It also means we can avoid all the craziness around like every type being nullable in GraphQL. We don't talk about that enough. I have so many feelings. I also quote tweeted this, and I think I summarized my thoughts here very well. The purpose of APIs is to serve clients. If your client is a front end, it should serve that front end in the best possible way. Why does anyone disagree on this? Even the backend people are agreeing with this more and more with stuff like HTMX, which makes it trivial to not respond with JSON, instead respond with new HTML to render in specific places. Both backend and frontend feel this way, but they love to point at the other and say, hey, you're doing it wrong. We need to stop that. We need to understand both sides are trying and both sides want to build great experiences for users, but the backend should do what the front end needs. The front end should do what the backend needs. But ideally, we're starting where the users are. And crazy enough, the users are usually starting on the front end. This is why I am a huge proponent of backend for front end and building in a way that allows you as the developer to get exactly what you need without being blocked by 15 teams worth of red tape. If you have to do a slightly different database query, just do it. Why do we have all of these steps and all of this bullshit if you don't need it? And I guarantee you, I would die on the hill that this REST API is only being used for that UI. And if that is the case, which I am near certain it is, then this was a dumb tweet. If this API is being exposed externally, nullify everything I said, this is dumb. But if this is an API that just happens to be REST in terms of implementation detail, and this is what the UI needed, this is a great API. And APIs should start from what the user needs. That's all I have to say on this. I'm increasingly tired of people being so obnoxious about backends being this perfect thing and front ends coming in and ruining it. Because we all have to build for our users. If you want to learn a bit more about my philosophy around how we load data and use these types of tools like gRPC, put a video in the corner there all about it. Thank you guys as always. Really appreciate you. See you in the next one. Peace, nerds.